I'm going to deviate slightly from, well, not really. The effortless being part, I want to talk about more probably in my session in the San Martin room afterwards at 11. But just before we started, Helen Palmer, who's following me, said, how do we get here? And I just want to take a bit of time to look, how did we get here? How has really the emergence of this whole new spirituality, this spiritual renaissance that we're part of, which isn't new, it's timeless, and yet something fascinating and fundamentally new is happening on the planet at this time. And for me, as a child of the 60s, and probably the 5% of you in the audience who are as old as me can relate to this, it was perfect. DJ Dragonfly last night was the perfect setup for me. Starting off with the Summer of Love and all that music. Something happened back then in our culture. 1967, well, it was the whole 60s, but somehow 1967 was the high point in many ways of what was happening. And I was fortunate enough to be not too young and not too old. I was 21, and so free from all that parental influence, but not old enough to be sucked into all the, regular life. So much was happening then. I mean, it was the beginning of the whole feminist movement, the whole sexual revolution, alternative health, organic food. All of this was beginning back then, the seeds of it. I mean, the seeds were a long way back. This is when the seeds started flourishing back then, 50 years ago. And it was, of course, the whole psychedelic movement was happening then. And out of that came the recognition of the value of spirituality. We were coming out of being, just in our traditional, closeted religions, whatever you were brought up in, most of this culture, probably the Judeo-Christian, Islamic religion, some of them may have been in more Eastern cultures. But we were recognizing there were ways in which we could change our consciousness, and that was the fundamental thing, was how do we change our consciousness? And there was this progression which happened from, seeing it was through the psychedelics, LSD was the primary one back then, and others. That was changing consciousness, but then there was this realization, no, these spiritual traditions, they've got something. And we were reading the Upanishads and the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and not really understanding them. But that was the inspiration, like there's a way in which we can actually change our consciousness. And that's been the journey we've really been on the last 50 years. And a seed of that, which has, I think, stayed with us ever since, it was actually back in June 1967, the Beatles recorded All You Need Is Love, which is almost like the anthem of this whole movement. And something I always remember, which I think was so significant, that was the first ever global television broadcast. The first ever global television broadcast was a program called One World. And so it was One World, it went out globally. And part of that program was the Beatles recording live the final track for All You Need Is Love. That to me, at the time, it just seemed so significant. And for me, it just continues to be really significant, because since then, in a way, we've been on this journey of how do we do that? How do we actually come from love? How do we do that? That's been the journey, our collective journey in a way. And we've been through the era of the gurus. I mean, back then in the 60s, early 70s, we collectively, me included, all rushing off to India. That was where the teachings were in India. We were going and following various teachers, various gurus. And I was part of that, and it was fascinating because it was two things happened for me in my trip to India. I got involved with TM, Transcendental Meditation, following the Beatles, because 2 months after they recorded All You Need Is Love, the Beatles met the Maharishi and started meditating, and that really put meditation on the map. And within a few years, all this scientific research started coming out on TM, and suddenly meditation was respectable. And that was the beginning, I think, of the whole interest in meditation. I, at the time, wasn't really interested in spirituality because I wasn't interested in religion. I was a mathematician, theoretical physicist. Religion for me was just a load of weird old mumbo-jumbo that had no relevance whatsoever to life in the then 20th century. But I got interested in meditation because I was interested in mind and consciousness and how had consciousness come into the world, how had the universe evolved into the place where I could do the mathematics of hydrogen. We'd evolved from hydrogen, and here was I doing the mathematics of hydrogen in quantum physics. Like, this was weird. So I got interested in consciousness, and that took me into meditation. And what I realized when I got to India was there was something to spirituality. Not necessarily to religion, but to spirituality. I saw that all the different traditions had this common core, this common essence. And I became fascinated by what was that common essence. And I think, what's happened over time is there's been individuals who've had this realization about the nature of self, the nature of consciousness, and in that realization has come this incredible sense of peace, relief, but also an opening of the heart, of love, and it's been transforming, and they wanted to share it with the people around them, with their friends, their students, their disciples. But what happens is, when you're sharing that wisdom, there's the person who's realized it, they share it with other people, and the other people get maybe 90% of it. Bits they don't understand, bits get forgotten, bits get added in, they pass it on to their people, bits more get forgotten, added in, and gradually it's like a game of Chinese whispers. You know that where you pass a message around a room and it ends up totally different. I remember the one when I was growing up, we used to have this joke, the message was, send reinforcements, we're going to advance, and it went down the line, chain of command, and ended up, send 3 and 4-pence, we're going to a dance. But that's happened with that essence of spirituality, that essence. It's got dressed up in different cultures, different clothes, different doctrines, different rituals, and it's been translated from one language to another, from one culture to another, and it ends up as all these completely different religions, which all seem to be so different in various ways, and we don't see what that common essence is that really gave life to them all in the first place. So I became fascinated by that. And also the realization that this was what is needed in the world today so much. Even back then, I'm beginning to see the environmental problems were beginning to come into focus, social problems, and just wherever I looked, whatever problem, they all came back in one way or another to human consciousness, to human values, human decisions, maybe human short-sightedness, human self-centeredness. And what all the traditions were doing in one way or another were pointing towards how we could relieve ourselves of that dysfunctional, self-centered way of thinking and operating, and to get back in touch with our true selves, our true nature, and allow that to come through so that we're no longer dictated by what I now call the ego mind. And that was a real revelation. I think that was a revelation that was happening to our whole culture, that realization. And so we went through the age of the gurus, going to India. We then had the sort of the workshop phase, the ests, and it became more psychological, looking at personal development. And then later there was the whole Buddhist influence started coming in much more strongly. And then in the last, I suppose, 10 years, but it's been there all the time, this recognition of what we're calling non-duality, which this conference is inspired by. The non-dual teachings, to me, are the essence of what was always there. You know, there is nowhere to go. There's nowhere to get to. Ram Dass put it perfectly, be here now. We already are here now. We are never anywhere else but be here now. But we get so distracted by our thoughts and all that stuff, we start getting into the past and the future. And it's about letting go of that, just coming back to who we are, coming back to our true nature. And I think what's been happening over the last 50 years is we've been stripping away all that, the additions of time, of culture, of all the rituals and doctrines and dogmas. We're stripping them away, just coming back to what is that pure, essential wisdom. And it's no longer we have to go to India to find that, because many people here have been on their own journey of awakening, and we're beginning to have really awakened people in our own culture where we can go to. Come here. Some of the great people here who are expressing that wisdom, that core wisdom of just coming back to being here, and how the effort, the trying, and all that other stuff actually gets in the way of our own self-recognition. But that's the journey we've been on. And what is manifesting here at this event is seeing that common thing. What should be apparent to most of you is it's not all these people are saying different things. We're all pointing to the same thing. We're all pointing to the same truth. I was giving a talk a little while back, and somebody came up to me at the end and said, "What is it you're saying that's different from what everybody else was saying?" And my response was, nothing, I hope. Because if I'm saying something different from what everybody else is saying, then I'm clearly off track. And I think something else that's been happening, I was saying back, it's always been there, the non-duality. When I first started getting interested in this stuff, I was reading the Upanishads, and lots of different translations of the Upanishads, which is probably one of the oldest non-dual teachings that we still have. And from what we know, probably historically, the beginning of non-duality. That's where Advaita comes from, Advaita, non-dual. It goes right back 2,500 years to the time of the Upanishads. And I was reading that stuff and thinking, okay, there's this thing called the pure self, which, if I really meditate a lot and spend, really good discipline, hard work, and really focus, then maybe in 10, 20, 30 years, I will have this experience of discovering this true self somehow. It's like, And then just as time goes on, just realizing, it's not about another experience. It's not about something different. It's about recognizing that which is already there, which has always been there. And what's happening, I'll talk about this a little bit more in the presentation afterwards. The early translations of all these texts were done by very earnest, sincere European academics, philosophers, students of religion, and they went out east and discovered these completely new teachings, completely new religions, completely different cultures, completely different languages, and they were fascinated by what it means, and they started exploring, what's this all about? But they were coming at it from an intellectual, academic point of view. What's happening now is we are coming at it from our own experience and begin to say, oh, this is what it means. This is what it means. And I don't know about you, but my experience so often over the years has been like, now I get it. Another 5 years later, now I get it. But it's this gradual peeling away of the layers of the onion, and we begin to see just how simple it really is. I mean, just to give you one example, the word Ananda. I'm sure most of you here have heard the word Ananda. It's translated, the standard translation is bliss, and the word bliss in English has this whole connotation of being some ecstatic, perhaps orgasmic, out of this world, extreme sort of happiness that completely takes you over. And back then we're like, okay, the bliss, we're heading for bliss. That's what we're heading for, is this ultimate bliss. You look at the root meaning of the word. The long A in Sanskrit means great. The short A, as in Advaita, means not. But the long A means great. And Nanda means contentment. Contentment. And when you start translating Ananda as great contentment, it makes a whole different sense. It's not some blissful experience out there that's going to take us over. It can happen. I'm not to say that doesn't happen. But what's really happening in our journey is we're coming back to ourselves, coming back to our true nature, and in that, discovering the great contentment of just being who we are without all that distraction of unnecessary thinking and worry and planning and all that stuff. Our natural state is one of great contentment. That's what we're looking for. And in a way, the spiritual journey is just bringing us right back to ourselves. Instead of looking out there for the great contentment and happiness, it's saying, hang on, it's right here. And so that I see as in a way, the journey we've been on in the last 50 years, looking out there for something, and then gradually just the whole journey turning around 180 degrees, bringing us right back to being here now, to quote the lovely Ram Dass, who, by the way, is an example of someone who's followed his path. His was the path of love. And any of you who've been privileged enough to see or be with Ram Dass in recent years, he, to me, is the most shining example of anybody on the planet today who is just living and emanating love. And that comes right back to the Beatles.